I'm going to give you a snapshot of 180 years of flooding in 5 minutes.
That should be easy.
I've found that there have been approximately 180 floods since the mid-1840s, so that's 180 floods in 180 years. And the earliest documented flood reference was reported in the Northern Star in 1902, and it referred to Terania Creek rising 40 feet in one night. Now that may or not be true, of course that wouldn't have been an accurate measurement, but it's just a sort of coincidental that here we are on Terania Creek, and that's the oldest documented flood reference that I could find. Anna's mentioned that the big flood last year was measured at 14.32. That's considerably higher than any other flood that the Channon has experienced. For example, in 1989 it was 11 metres, 1962 10.98, and 1954 10.95. And it's also interesting that in the catchment in Lismore and various other places, the mega flood of last year was about 2 metres or a little bit more higher than what was previously the record high floods. Now, Lismore and the Wilson-Leicester catchment have a very interesting flood history. For example, there are, I find, two very interesting things. The latter half of the 1800s was a very wet period, and there were a lot of floods in that 50 years from the 1840s to the 1890s. But then from 1895 to 1945 was a relatively drier period. I remember reading that in that 50 years, Sydney had the same total rainfall over that 50 years as it did in the following 30 years. And we all know that the period since the late 1940s, starting with the big flood in 1954, has been a very wet period. So we had that wet period for 50 years, a much drier period for 50 years with many fewer floods, and then in the 70 years since or 80 years really, since the 1940s, we've had another wet period with a lot of floods. And if we look at the major floods, of course a major flood in Lismore means that a major flood in all or most of the catchment anyway, so I'm really talking about the catchment as a whole. But in the 1849 to 1895 period, that wetter period, there were 12 to 15 major floods in Lismore, and that works out at about one every 3.5 years. I say 12 to 15 because prior to the rowing club gauge being installed in 1917 in Lismore, there are few accurate records of flood heights in the earlier period. But from 1896 to 1944, there are only 3 major floods, which averaged out at one every 16 years compared to one every 3.5 years before. And in the period since 1945, again, there have been a lot of floods, 23 major floods working out at about one every 3.5 years. So that's, I find that a very interesting difference, that wet period, dry period, wet period. That's, I mean, we can't assume that there are going to be those sorts of fluctuations in the future, but, well, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. I better move on. The other interesting thing about flooding is when the floods occur during the calendar year. Our peak flood period is February and March, and more than half of our major floods have occurred in those 2 months. So that's something like 53% of our major floods in 16% of the year. The period from April to July is our, if you like, mid-flood period, and about 40% of the floods have occurred in that part of the year, which is about a third of the year. And that leaves the rest of the year, August through to January inclusive, and only 8% of floods have occurred, major floods have occurred in that 6-month period. So our flooding is very skewed towards February and March. And it's also interesting that the major floods that occurred in February and March were higher than the major floods at any other time of the year. For example, the major floods in February and March were about, this is in Lismore, and no doubt it would have been replicated in various other parts of the catchment. The February-March major floods were 1.2 metres on average higher than the major floods that occurred in the rest of the year. It's also interesting to note that of the 7 highest floods Lismore has ever had, 6 of them were in that February to March period.
I think you've got them up there on your slide, Ed.
Yes,
That's them.
that's right, yeah. And we've got the new figure for the Channon in February 2022, which we didn't know before, thanks to Ken and Matt. And Ken's measurements and Matt's measurements were almost exactly the same. There's about a centimetre difference between them, I think. The moderate and minor floods in Lismore occur mainly January through to June. Again, that period from the latter half of the year is much drier, as reflected in the fact that about 80% of the minor and moderate floods occur in the January to June period, and only 17% of them occur in the July to December period. Another interesting feature is that of the approximately 180 floods we've had in that 180 years, 80 years didn't record a flood. There might have been a nuisance flood below minor level. So all of the 180 floods that we've had have occurred in 100 of the years. The other thing that I looked at, somebody said to me a while ago, bearing in mind that we've got a very complex catchment with 6 major creeks, 4 of them joining up to become Leicester Creek when it reaches Lismore, and then Cooper's Creek and Wilson's Creek become the Wilson's River and also meeting Lismore. So in effect, in a big flood situation, we've got 6 separate floods coming down those 6 major valleys. And the idea of the maximum possible flood seems to be if each of those crests arrived at Lismore at the same time, we'll have the maximum possible flood. CSIRO, as you know, have been doing some recent studies on flooding in the catchment, and Jai, isn't it? Jai, the senior hydrologist, thinks that the Leicester crest and the Wilson crest arrived in Lismore about 20 minutes apart in the mega flood of last year. It beggars belief that we could have a maximum possible flood again, another 2 metres higher than that, but I guess anything's possible. Now, the other thing that Annie referred to, somebody said to me once, would it help if we had a clear idea of how long it takes for the crest to flow down each of these 6 major creeks and gets to Lismore? And I thought, well, it's worth looking at, but alas, it was a useless exercise. I thought the best place to look would be how long it takes for the, well, no, not how long it takes, but what is the elapsed time between the peak at Nimbin and the peak at Gilmangar, because there are no major inflows between Nimbin and Gilmangar. Unlike, I mean, you look at how long the time between the peak at the Channon and the peak at Lismore, we've got all the water coming down the other 3 creeks that join up with the water from here down near Tumcester. So there are a lot of other factors that would come into play to influence the time between the peak at the Channon and the peak at Lismore. So I looked at the elapsed times between the peaks at Nimbin and the peaks at Gilmagar, and I found, looking at 15 floods where we've got accurate times and peak times, the shortest time between the peak at Nimbin and the peak at Gilmagar 3 times was 1 hour and 45 minutes, which seems remarkably quick. The longest was 20 hours and 30 minutes, and the average was 9 hours and 13 minutes. So it's a pretty useless exercise because I looked at lots of other places like Corndale to Lismore and Bentley to Lismore and so, and there's just wide variation in every case that I look. So it's not helpful, although it might be helpful to know how quickly sometimes the peaks can move from A to B. Just a couple of comments to round off. When will the next flood be and how high will it be? Nobody knows. What of El Nino? We're moving into an El Nino period, and usually they last for, I think the shortest period that the BOM says was 9 months, and the longest period a couple of years. So maybe we're looking at a couple of years of relatively drier weather, but that doesn't mean we can't have a flood in an El Nino period. It just means that it's less likely. There's a lot more I could say, but I'll leave it there, and I'll be happy to have a conversation or answer any questions that you might have later on.
Thank you. Thank you.